At some point in modern military history, there have been operations that defied all expectations, moments when technology reached its limits and human audacity prevailed where logic dictated it was impossible. This is the story of one such operation, a mission that began as a desperate gamble and ended up rewriting the manuals of aerial combat. It's a narrative about men who flew where they shouldn't have, did what they couldn't, and survived when all the calculations indicated otherwise. The early morning was dark that day, darker than usual. There was no moon, only the distant glow of stars that barely managed to pierce the low cloud cover. In the airbase hangar, 6 pilots received the final briefing for a mission that many considered extremely risky. The target was a chain of 6 enemy anti-aircraft positions that formed an impenetrable corridor, protecting a vital strategic installation. These positions were not simple isolated batteries. They were integrated air defense systems, each equipped with tracking radars, automatic cannons, and guided missiles. Together, they created an extremely dangerous zone stretching for kilometers, a barrier that had already shot down dozens of aircraft in the preceding months. Before we continue this extraordinary story, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what time you're watching. Let's go. The military commanders had tried everything. High-altitude attacks, night bombing raids, electronic suppression missions, even attempts to saturate the defenses with multiple aircraft simultaneously. Nothing worked. The enemy had created a fortress in the air, and every attempt to penetrate it resulted in devastating losses. The statistics were grim. Of every 10 aircraft that tried to cross that corridor, only 3 returned to base. The pilots began calling it the dangerous corridor, and morale was plummeting. But the installation those defenses protected was too critical to ignore. It was a command and control center, a vital node in the enemy communications network. Neutralizing it could alter the course of the entire conflict. So, the strategists went back to the drawing board, desperately searching for a solution that wouldn't result in catastrophic losses. It was then that a young tactical planning officer presented an idea that seemed absurd at first glance. What if, instead of flying high to avoid cannons or medium to minimize exposure time, they did the exact opposite? What if they flew so low that the defense systems themselves couldn't track them properly? The idea was met with skepticism. Flying low meant a greater risk of collision with the terrain, especially at night. It meant less reaction time if something went wrong. It meant navigating valleys and skirting mountains using only instruments and a perfect reading of the terrain. But the more the planners analyzed the proposal, the more sense it made. Air defense systems, however sophisticated, had physical limitations. Their radars were designed to detect threats coming from above or at the same level. Radar coverage had blind spots, especially in rugged terrain. If an aircraft could fly low enough, fast enough, using the terrain as a shield, perhaps, just perhaps, it could penetrate that air fortress. The 6 pilots selected for the mission were not novices. They were veterans, men who had accumulated hundreds of hours of flight in adverse conditions. But even for them, what was being proposed was something beyond anything they had ever done. They studied every meter of the terrain they would need to traverse. They memorized rock formations, elevations, river courses, any feature that could serve as a point of reference in the darkness. They trained in simulators until every movement became instinctive, until they could fly that route with their eyes closed. And then, when the meteorologists confirmed that the ideal weather window was approaching, when the combination of cloud cover and atmospheric conditions would create the perfect opportunity, they knew it was time. The aircraft took off at precise intervals, each following a slightly different route to the convergence point. They couldn't fly in formation during the approach because that would increase their radar signature. Each pilot was alone with his thoughts, alone with his instruments, alone with the awareness of what he was about to do. The first stage of the mission went according to plan. They flew at normal cruising altitude, maintaining standard radio communications, deliberately allowing the enemy to detect them. It was part of the strategy. Let them think this is just another reconnaissance mission, another routine flight they can monitor and ignore. The real operation would only begin when they reached the descent point. When the formation leader reached the designated coordinates, he pushed the control stick forward. The aircraft dove at a steep angle, rapidly dropping through the clouds. The altimeters spun wildly as he descended, 1,000 meters, 500, 200. The terrain below was invisible in the darkness, but he knew exactly where he was. He had memorized every detail of that region. With surgical precision, he leveled the aircraft just 100 meters from the ground. The speed increased. The roar of the engines echoed through the hills below him. Behind him, the other 5 pilots executed the same maneuver in sequence, each emerging from the cloud cover to join a mad dash through the night. In enemy air traffic control centers, radar operators watched their screens with the routine efficiency of those who have been doing this for months. They had detected the 6 aircraft during the approach, tracking their trajectories with ease. But then, something strange happened. One by one, the markings disappeared from the screens. It wasn't a gradual disappearance, it wasn't electronic interference. The aircraft simply vanished, as if they had been erased from reality. The commanding officer in the control center frowned. What kind of evasive maneuver was this? He ordered the operators to change the scanning frequencies, to increase the transmission power of the radars. Nothing. The aircraft had completely disappeared. For a moment, he considered the possibility that they had aborted the mission and returned to base. But something in his military instinct told him no. Something was happening, something his systems weren't detecting. Meanwhile, the mission leader navigated through a narrow valley, his wings passing meters from the rocky walls on either side. The speed was so high that the slightest error in judgment would result in instant disaster. But he had no time to think about consequences. His mind was completely focused on the present moment, reading the instruments, adjusting course, maintaining precise altitude. Through the radio, he could hear the controlled breathing of the other pilots. No one spoke. There was no need. Each knew exactly what they had to do. They had rehearsed it dozens of times. Now it was just a matter of perfect execution. The first anti-aircraft position was less than 10 kilometers ahead. It was a formidable installation, protected by concrete walls, equipped with redundant detection systems and multiple weapon systems. During the day, its cannons could shoot down targets kilometers away with impressive precision. But now, in the darkness, its operators looked to the sky unaware that a threat was approaching at supersonic speeds, flying so low that it was literally below the minimum tracking limit of their radars. Modern air defense systems are marvels of engineering, capable of processing thousands of data points per second, tracking multiple targets simultaneously, calculating interception vectors with lethal precision. But they all share a fundamental limitation. They need to see the target to neutralize it. And when a target flies below the radar line of sight, when it uses the terrain itself as a shield, when it moves so fast and so low that there is hardly time to react, even the most advanced systems become useless. The mission leader saw the first anti-aircraft position appear on his display. It was exactly where intelligence had said it would be, atop a hill, its radar antennas slowly swirling in the night air. He adjusted his sights, his fingers dancing over the weapon controls. The window of opportunity would be minimal, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds at most. But 2 or 3 seconds were all he needed. The weapon system locked onto the target. He pulled the trigger. The missiles fired from their pylons with a deafening roar, tracing brilliant arcs through the night. Seconds later, the first position was neutralized in an explosion that illuminated the entire valley. But he didn't linger to admire his work. He was already turning to the next target, his engines roaring as he accelerated even further. In the enemy control center, chaos had ensued. Confused reports began to arrive. Position Alpha was offline. No communication, no radar signals, just silence. The commander tried to make contact through alternative channels. Nothing. It was as if the entire installation had simply ceased to exist. He ordered the other positions to raise the alert, to sweep all quadrants for threats. But before his orders could be fully implemented, another report arrived. Position Beta was also silent. And then Position Gamma. In a matter of minutes, half of his air defense network had been neutralized, and he had no idea how or by whom. The pilots continued their perilous race through the night. The second and third targets had been neutralized with the same surgical precision as the first. Each attack had lasted only seconds, each executed with perfect synchronicity that was the result of weeks of planning and intensive training. But now came the most difficult part of the mission. The 3 remaining anti-aircraft positions were closer together, forming a defensive triangle. Neutralizing them would require the 6 pilots to coordinate their attacks with millisecond precision. One mistake, a delay of just a few seconds, and the communication network between the positions could allow them to coordinate an effective response. The mission leader checked his position. He was approximately 2 minutes from the next attack point. Through the radio, he transmitted a single word, a code that everyone had memorized. The other 5 pilots confirmed it, their voices calm despite the adrenaline that surely coursed through their veins. They split into 3 pairs, each heading for one of the remaining targets. Synchronization was now everything. If one position managed to transmit an alert before being destroyed, the others might have enough time to activate their near-point defense systems, their last line of defense against close-range attacks. The 4th position was nestled on a small plateau, its defenses primarily directed toward the sky. Its operators were still trying to understand what had happened to the other 3 positions when the first 2 aircraft appeared on the horizon, flying so low they almost touched the trees. There was a moment of absolute shock, an instant frozen in time when the defenders simply couldn't process what they were seeing. And then the missiles arrived, and that moment of hesitation was decisive. The installation was neutralized in a series of impacts that shook the ground for miles around. Simultaneously, in the other 2 locations, identical scenes were unfolding. The 5th and 6th anti-aircraft positions were hit at the exact same second, a coordination so perfect it could have been choreographed. To observers on the ground, it seemed impossible. How had 6 aircraft penetrated the most heavily defended corridor in the region, neutralized 6 fortified positions, and done all this without suffering a single casualty? How had they become invisible to radar systems that cost millions in investment? The answer lay in the audacity of the plan and the skill of its execution. They hadn't become invisible. They had simply flown in a place where the radars couldn't see them. But the mission was not yet complete. The anti-aircraft positions had been neutralized, but the primary target, the command and control facility, was still intact. And now, with its external defenses disabled, its commanders knew an attack was underway. They would activate all emergency protocols, disperse critical equipment, perhaps even evacuate key personnel. The pilots had only a narrow window of opportunity before the enemy could regroup. They accelerated, pushing their aircraft to the limits of their capabilities. Fuel was starting to run low, but there was still enough to complete the attack and return to base. At least that's what the calculations said. The command and control facility was an underground complex, protected by meters of reinforced concrete. A difficult target, but not impossible. The pilots had carried weaponry specially designed for penetrating fortified structures, guided bombs capable of piercing multiple layers of protection before detonating. But first, they needed to locate the exact entry points, the areas where the structure was most vulnerable. Intelligence had provided precise coordinates, but in the darkness and at the speed they were flying, finding those points would require all their skill. The formation leader spotted the complex emerging through his night vision system. It was larger than the reconnaissance images had suggested, an extensive network of buildings and underground facilities. Emergency lights flashed everywhere, signs that the enemy was on high alert. But alert didn't mean prepared. The outer defenses had been disabled. Now there were only a few point defense cannons, ineffective against fast-moving targets. He identified the first point of attack, a ventilation building that supplied air to the deeper underground levels. Neutralize that, and you force the evacuation of the entire facility. The first bomb fell with perfect precision, penetrating through the roof of the ventilation building before detonating deep within. The entire structure trembled, then collapsed in on itself. Throughout the underground complex, alarms began to sound as oxygen levels started to plummet. But the pilots weren't finished. One by one, they delivered their payloads to strategic points in the complex. Emergency power generators, communication stations, reinforced entrances. Each attack was calculated to maximize disruption to enemy operations with minimal human casualties. The goal was to neutralize the facility's operational capability. In less than 5 minutes, the facility that had coordinated enemy operations for months was incapacitated. Its communication systems were disabled, its power sources eliminated, its command structures fragmented. It would take weeks, perhaps months, to rebuild that operational capability. And in that time, the balance of power in the region would shift dramatically. The 6 pilots regrouped after the attack, forming a loose flight line as they began their return journey. But now they faced a new problem. The enemy knew they were under attack. Interceptor fighters were being launched from neighboring bases. Air defense systems from other regions were being activated, creating new danger zones that did not exist on their entry route. And there was another complication. One of the pilots, number 4 in the original formation, had taken damage during the attack on the 5th anti-aircraft position. A fragment of shrapnel had struck his vertical stabilizer, compromising his directional control. He was flying, but each maneuver required extra effort. Each course correction consumed more fuel than it should. The mission leader made a quick decision. They couldn't leave anyone behind. If pilot number 4 couldn't maintain speed, everyone would slow down. If he needed an escort to return to base, he would have one. It was a calculated risk. Flying slower meant more exposure time, more opportunities for the enemy to intercept them. But it was a risk worth taking if it meant everyone returned alive. The enemy interceptor fighters were now in the air, sweeping the region in search of the attackers. But they were searching at conventional altitudes, expecting to find the aircraft where aircraft normally flew. It didn't occur to them, at least not immediately, that the attackers were still flying at extremely low altitudes, using the same terrain that had protected them during the outward mission. It was a tactic so unconventional that it simply wasn't in the standard operating procedure manuals. And this misunderstanding bought the 6 pilots the precious minutes they needed. The return trip seemed to last an eternity. Every minute was a battle against fatigue, against dwindling fuel levels, against the constant strain of flying in extreme conditions. Pilot number 4 struggled with his damaged controls, his muscles aching from the effort of keeping the aircraft steady. But he continued, refusing to consider the possibility of failure. Beside him, pilot number 5 flew in close formation, ready to intervene if anything went wrong, ready to provide any assistance that might be needed. It was this kind of camaraderie, this unwavering loyalty between pilots, that often made the difference between success and disaster. When they finally crossed back into friendly territory, when the beacons of their home air base appeared on the horizon, it was as if an immense weight had been lifted from their shoulders. They had done the impossible. They had penetrated defenses that were considered impenetrable. They had neutralized 6 anti-aircraft positions and a critical command installation. And they had done all this without losing a single aircraft. It was the kind of mission upon which legends are built, the kind of operation that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. The 6 aircraft landed in sequence, their engines finally silencing after hours of operation at maximum capacity. When the pilots emerged from their cockpits, they were exhausted, drenched in sweat, their hands trembling slightly with the adrenaline still coursing through their systems. But there was also a sense of accomplishment, a profound understanding that they had just done something extraordinary. The commanders who greeted them on the runway were visibly emotional. They had observed the mission through data transmissions, had followed each phase of the operation with a mixture of hope and terror. To see all 6 aircraft return was more than they had expected. It was almost miraculous. The debriefing lasted for hours. Every aspect of the mission was analyzed in minute detail. What worked, what could have been done better, what lessons could be learned for future operations. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in how the enemy had reacted, or more precisely, how they had failed to react effectively. The technique of extremely low-altitude flight was not new in itself, but it had never been applied on such a scale, against such sophisticated defenses, with such devastating results. This would change the way airstrikes were planned and executed. It would open up new tactical possibilities that were previously considered impractical. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the operation was not technical, but human. 6 men had faced impossible odds and prevailed through a combination of skill, courage, and unwavering mutual trust. They had trained together, flown together, and when the time came to execute one of the most dangerous missions ever conceived, they had executed it with near-perfect precision. There was no room for individual egos on that mission. Each pilot depended on the others for success, for survival. And this interdependence had created a bond that would last a lifetime. In the days and weeks that followed, the full importance of the mission became clear. The destruction of the command and control facility had created a leadership vacuum in enemy operations. Their forces, once coordinated with military precision, now operated in a disorganized manner, reacting to events rather than anticipating and shaping the battlefield. This created opportunities that were quickly exploited. Territories that had been contested for months were secured in a matter of days. Supply lines that had been under constant threat became safe. The strategic balance of the entire region fundamentally shifted. But success in combat always comes at a cost, even when there are no direct casualties. The 6 pilots carried the memories of that night with them for the rest of their lives. The images of installations being neutralized, the adrenaline of flying at extreme speeds meters above the ground, the weight of knowing that a mistake would have resulted in serious consequences. Some dealt with it better than others. Some returned to flying combat missions without hesitation. Others requested transfers to training roles, feeling they had pushed their luck to the limit and didn't want to try it again. Pilot number 4, the one whose aircraft had been damaged during the mission, became an instructor at one of the most prestigious military flight schools. He dedicated the rest of his career to teaching young pilots not only the technical skills necessary for combat flight, but also the importance of teamwork, meticulous planning, and never underestimating the importance of training until complex procedures become second nature. His classes always included the story of that mission, not as a form of boasting, but as a case study of how proper planning and precise execution can overcome seemingly any obstacle. The formation leader, the man who had commanded the mission from that cockpit, eventually rose to the highest positions of military leadership. But he always said that no decision he made in his long career was more important than those he made during those crucial minutes over enemy territory. Deciding to continue the mission when the stakes seemed so high. Deciding to slow down the entire formation to support a wounded comrade. Deciding to trust his pilots to perform their duties flawlessly. These decisions, made under extreme pressure, had defined not only the outcome of the mission, but who he was as a leader. The story of this operation was kept secret for many years. The techniques developed were too sensitive to be publicly disclosed. But eventually, as the years passed and technology evolved, the story was declassified. When it finally became public, it captured the imagination of people around the world. Not just military enthusiasts or strategy scholars, but anyone who appreciated stories about ordinary people performing extraordinary feats under extreme pressure. Documentaries were made, books were written, each attempting to capture the essence of what had happened that night. But they all agreed on one point. This wasn't just a story about aircraft and weapons, about technology and tactics. It was a story about the human capacity for innovation under pressure, about courage in the face of impossible odds, about the strength that comes from fully trusting those around you. It was a reminder that, however advanced our technology becomes, it is still people who make the ultimate difference. People with their skills, their determination, their refusal to accept that something is impossible simply because it has never been done before. The phrase that appeared in that enemy air traffic control report, those panicked words that escaped a confused radar operator as aircraft vanished from their screens, became almost legendary. It's below our altitude, we can't track it. It was an admission of impotence, a declaration that their sophisticated defenses had been bypassed by a tactic so audaciously simple that they simply hadn't considered it. Those words encapsulated the entire spirit of the operation. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem isn't in more advanced technology or superior brute force. Sometimes it's in thinking differently, in questioning assumptions, in being willing to try something everyone says can't be done. The 6 pilots eventually retired from active service, but they kept in touch over the years. They met annually on the anniversary of the mission, sharing memories, laughing at moments of tension that they could now see with the perspective that time provides. When one of them passed away, the other 5 were there, paying their last respects to a comrade who had flown through fire with them. And when the last of the 6 eventually departs, the story of their mission will remain, preserved in military archives, told in classrooms, remembered by all those who understand that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. This story reminds us that there are moments in history when ordinary individuals are called upon to do extraordinary things. Moments when circumstances demand more than we thought we were capable of. And in those moments, we discover reserves of strength, skill, and determination that we didn't know we possessed. The 6 pilots weren't superheroes. They were ordinary men with exceptional training, facing an extraordinary situation. But through their preparation, their skill, their commitment to each other and to their mission, they achieved something truly remarkable. In a world increasingly dominated by technology, artificial intelligence, and automated systems, it's easy to forget the human element. But this story reminds us that, in the end, it's still people who make the difference. People who make tough decisions under pressure. People who trust each other even when the odds are impossible. People who refuse to give up even when the path ahead seems insurmountable. That's the real lesson of this mission. No matter how sophisticated our machines are, how advanced our systems are, we still depend on courageous, skilled, and determined men and women to operate them when the stakes are highest. As we reflect on this extraordinary operation, on the men who executed it, and the choices they made, we are reminded that history is shaped not only by vast, impersonal forces, but also by individual decisions made at crucial moments. 6 pilots chose to accept a mission that many considered extremely dangerous. They chose to trust their training, each other, and a plan that defied conventional wisdom. And through those decisions, they changed the course of events in ways that resonated far beyond that particular night. Their courage paved the way for new possibilities. Their innovation expanded what was considered feasible. Their success inspired others to challenge their own perceived limitations. Ultimately, this is a story about human potential, about what we can achieve when we refuse to accept limitations, when we work together with a common purpose, when we prepare adequately and then have the courage to execute even when the outcome is uncertain. It's a story that transcends its specific military context and speaks to anyone who has ever faced seemingly insurmountable challenges. It reminds us that the impossible is often just what hasn't yet been tried in the right way. That victory isn't always about superiority of force, but about superiority of strategy, preparation, and execution. That sometimes, the greatest act of courage isn't attacking directly, but finding a different path that others haven't considered. The echoes of that mission still resonate today, decades after the events. In military academies around the world, students analyze every aspect of the operation, dissecting decisions, studying results, learning lessons that are as relevant today as they were then. But beyond military circles, the story has found a place in the broader public consciousness as a powerful example of what is possible when preparation meets opportunity, when skill meets courage, when innovation meets determination. It is a story that reminds us that, regardless of how advanced our society becomes, there is still fundamental value in timeless qualities such as bravery, loyalty, ingenuity, and resilience. And so, as we conclude this narrative of an extraordinary night, of 6 men who flew where they shouldn't have been able to fly, who did what shouldn't be possible to do, we are left not only with a story of military success, but with something deeper. An affirmation of humanity's capacity to overcome, to innovate, to reach beyond what we think are our limits. A reminder that in our darkest moments, when challenges seem insurmountable and odds impossible, there is still hope. Because as long as there are people willing to think differently, to train tirelessly, to trust each other completely, and to bravely advance in the face of danger, nothing is truly impossible. This is the legacy of that mission. Not just tactical objectives achieved or enemy operations disrupted, but a lasting demonstration of the best that humanity can be when we are tested to our limits and refuse to break. May the Lord God bless all those who served with courage, all who risked everything in the name of something greater than themselves, and may their stories continue to inspire future generations to find within themselves the same strength, the same determination, the same refusal to accept defeat that these 6 pilots demonstrated on that memorable night.